All right, great. Last thing I need to do is read through our hearing script. This basically just covers the hearing of the procedure, and then we'll jump right into it. Excuse me. Okay, this is the December 8th, 2021 session of the zoning hearing examiner docket. My name is David Sturkey. I'm the zoning hearing examiner for the city of Cincinnati, and I'll preside over this hearing. The case before us today is case number ZH20210173. The purpose of this hearing is to allow applicants and opposing parties to testify and to offer and refute evidence and testimony. This hearing will follow the rules found in the zoning code and the supplemental rules of the zoning hearing examiner. All testimony and evidence that an applicant or any opposing party wishes to offer must be presented at this hearing unless a party has submitted evidence or testimony in the form of writing prior to this hearing. The hearing will proceed as follows. The applicant, the applicant's attorney, or the applicant's agent will first present the applicant's case. If there were anyone here from the public, they would then have an opportunity to speak after the applicant has presented its case. I will give our zoning department an opportunity to add any testimony that they feel is appropriate. I will then, in the event that any party testifies or offers argument in opposition to this application, the applicant will have an opportunity to rebut that testimony and or argument offered in opposition. And then finally, the applicant will have an opportunity to make a closing statement. So for our purposes here today, I'll give Mr. Koninger, am I saying that right, Koninger?
That's good.
Okay, give Mr. Koninger and to the extent Ms. Ruff would like to add any testimony, I'll give you guys an opportunity to tell me about the project, why it's appropriate, why you think I should grant the requested zoning relief. I'll then go over and give the zoning department an opportunity to weigh in, give you guys an opportunity to respond to anything that's been said by the zoning department, and then make any closing statements. After all presentations have been made, I will close the hearing. Decisions may be expected within 2 weeks. I may limit or exclude any testimony that I deem irrelevant or outside the scope of the application being considered. I may interrupt any speaker to ask questions or to make any comments. I may also refuse to consider hearsay testimony. That's generally evidence you want to introduce that consists of statements made by someone who's not present at this hearing. In the event of any technical difficulties or unforeseen circumstances with our video conferencing technology, I'll do my best to troubleshoot that on the fly, but to the extent there's some defect in the tech that prevents us from meaningfully going forward with this hearing today, I may continue or postpone this hearing. That'll be at my discretion. Okay, last thing I need to do is just swear in all of our witnesses. So if you intend on providing any testimony here today, making any comments, asking any questions, doing anything other than just strictly observing, then you need to be sworn in. So if that's you, if you could make sure that you're off mute, if you could raise your right hand, I need everyone to answer out loud. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, you're all now sworn. I'm going to be taking the lead here on the presentation of the applicant's case.
I will.
Okay, Mr. Koninger, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you for meeting with us this morning. I'm representing the Ruffs and the Ruff residents. That's the structure proposed for 2530 May Street. My goal this morning is to paint a different picture of this residence. And I really think despite all the variances that we're going to talk about, there's just a couple key issues that comes down to the approval of this. And those are both related to the height of the building. So I'm going to go over a couple items and then respond to the variances one by one, and then give some other input on the intent of the design. Before we got into that, pardon me, the code here, as we all know, is a form-based code. And just for general knowledge, general information, all codes by nature are an overlay. Whatever that district might be, you take that code, you lay it over a broad area, and you say, this is the code for this area. There's always instances where variances and variations occur, and the variance is there to help amend those gray areas. The form-based code, as the zoning staff said in their statement, is based on form, size, and context. And the intent of that form and context is something that's mentioned over and over again, even in their own review. So it's the context of the neighborhood, and it's the specific neighborhood on May Street that we're going to be looking at. And in the case of May Street, it's not just the zone that we're in, but the street is literally divided by two different codes. There's the rough residence side of the street, where you have a code that says we want 2.5 stories, we want a certain size. And then there's the other side of the street where you have a code that says you can be 4 stories tall, you can be a whole nother size. But both of those codes make up the context of the street. You can't write a code and say that it's contextual, which means it takes in the character of the entire street, and then say, well, for this residence, we're only going to look at this side of the street, and for this structure, we're only going to look at the other side of the street, because both sides of the street make up the context of the neighborhood where the rough residence is located. Across the street, a 4-story structure is completely acceptable. On the rough side of the street, it's limited to 2.5 stories.
What's the zoning district on the other side of the street?
The zoning on the other side of the street is I'm going to bring up their own review. As they state, and I believe it's page 2 on their review, on the other side of the street, the zone is T5NLS-0. And in that district, or transect, as they like to call it, that allows up to a 4-story structure. It also allows for a larger footprint. So in the T4, if I abbreviate that, in the T4 that the rough residence is located, the general parameters are small to medium footprint, 2.5 stories, and there's some other specifications, but those are the two that describe the overall scale of the structure. In the T5, you have a medium to large footprint and a 4-story structure. And when we're talking about the context of that street, and I'll get into this again later, when you look at, again, specifically this street, 70% of the structures on that street are already over 2.5 stories. They already have an eave height higher than ours. So the main point here is, you know, the zoning code is not a brick wall that's built down the middle of the street, especially if it's a contextual code. It takes in the whole street. And that's one of the things we're going to be referring to today. The other thing is kind of a general comment is the staff mentioned in their review that this lot had been vacant for several years. In fact, there's a number of things that aren't quite right in there, but you know, the structure on this site was actually started to be demolished in 2018. They took out their permit in 2018. The complete demolition, it was a very large home. The complete demolition was not done until October of 2018. And they got the final inspection in, I believe it was March of 2019. So we're at 2019 when this whole demolition is finally completed. The Ruffs purchased the lot in 2020. We started design in 2020. We submitted for a permit in 2021. So this is all happening a lot more recent. And part of that is important because there is a time period when you knock a structure down to when you start to rebuild a structure where they can look at the zoning and some things related to the zoning a little differently. I believe it's 2 years. It ended up being not an issue because, you know, we were delayed for a number of reasons on the design of the home. But this is all happening fairly recent time, I think is the critical thing to understand. So, and that's what brings us here today. So when we designed this home, you know, despite I think what you get when you read the staff's review letter, the form-based code is not a historic district. It does not create historic districts. It wants you to reflect, and the intent, it says, is to reflect the form and the context and the character of the neighborhood. That doesn't mean that every new structure has to be 2.5 stories and it has to have a mansard roof, which is the impression you get when you read their review. There are lots of ways to reflect the character of a neighborhood. And that's what makes it so cool to live in the city. You've got this happening here, and you've got a diversity of things happening, both with people and activities and structures. And we've all seen those instances where you have a very modern structure next to maybe a more historic structure or vernacular, and they work together. And that's what our design was intended to do. The Ruffs wanted a modern design. That's their right. There's nothing in the form-based code that says you can't have a modern or contemporary design. We reflected the neighborhood with the basic design structure of all of these homes. And they showed us a few of them in their application. I showed some in mine. But architecturally, they're all basically the same. You have a base that the main house sits on. You have the middle of the house, and then you have a hat. Somewhere in an architectural journal, all architecture breaks down. Even the Roman temples had a base, a middle, and a cap. So with the mansard prototype that they like to review so much, it's the same thing. You have a base of the house, which is generally masonry. You have the middle of the house, and then you have this mansard hat. If you put our design next to some of the other designs on the street, and especially the house that was there, as I did on one of the pages in my application, we've designed the same thing. We have a stone base made out of stone veneer. We have a middle of the house that's made out of brick. And then we have the top of the house that's made out of, it's not wood siding, but it's synthetic siding. It looks like wood. And as far as form and as far as the scale, pardon me, of this and the scale of our top, those are the same proportions as they are on a lot of these other homes. So that's how we blended the house into the neighborhood. Scale-wise, form, proportions, it's the same as all the other homes. Their homes are detailed differently, but it's the same basic scale. And I think that's important to consider as we go forward. So that's what started us on the design. So with that, and with the understanding of the entire context of the neighborhood that we're looking at, I'm going to talk about these variances one by one and respond to them. And in general, I'd like to say, even though they list 6 variances, this whole approval, I think, comes down to 2 issues, really 1 issue, and that's the height of the building, the eave height and the number of stories. I think we're very close on those. We are very close to what their intent was. It's just we're not strictly following that intent for a number of reasons that I'll illustrate. So the first variance I'm going to look at is variance number 4. And I'm not necessarily going to do these in order, but this is the easy one. Variance number 4, they're saying that, and I believe you have the application, so you should have our site plan in there. And I'm going to refer to our site plan that is on page 4 of the, actually page 4 of the staff's review. In that site plan, it shows 2 dimensions, and both are from the right-of-way, which is right behind the sidewalk, to our proposed home. The first dimension is 18.21 feet, and they refer to that in their review. The second dimension that they didn't refer to is 15 feet. And you'll see both of those dimensions on the front of the site plan there. 18.21 feet is the dimension from the right-of-way to the face of the house, to the wall that the garages are on. 15 feet, which is the required setback, is the distance from the right-of-way to the projections on the house. And we have a porch, like all the other houses on the street. We put a porch on ours. It has a retaining wall in front of it, has steps that go up to the porch, and it has an overhang above. These project out different distances, but typically when you have a front yard setback, any structural overhang or a porch or any part of the house that comes out from the face of the house, that's supposed to be behind the front yard setback. That's typical in any subdivision anywhere. So We have the 15-foot setback that they're requiring, but it goes to those canopies where it should. The 18.21 dimension that he was referring to goes to the house. So I think there was just a misreading of the site plan there on their part, but this variance isn't really needed. Variance number 4 is just a misunderstanding, I think, of the design of the home. If I were submitting this plan anywhere else, the porch, the overhangs, the canopies that come out from the house 3 and 4 feet, those would all have to be that behind that front yard setback, and that's what we did.
What do you mean anywhere else? Like anywhere else in?
Anywhere else in the city, in any other district, including this district, the front yard setback is to the foundation of the house or anything that projects out from that house. I have to be behind that front yard setback.
Okay, so you just mean different jurisdictions outside of city.
In other jurisdictions, other zoning districts, it's all the same. That's the purpose of the front yard setback, is to make sure that the structure of the house only gets so close to the street. They want a 15-foot setback. And what I'm saying is we provided that. It's just that the 15 feet should come from the furthest projection of the house, which is the porch and the canopies, not the foundation wall. So I think variance number 4 is a misunderstanding and a moot point.
Okay.
So if we proceed from there, unless you have any other questions.
Not right now, no.
Okay. So the next item is variance number 6, and that refers to the height of the so-called basement wall. And as we talk about that, I'm going to go to their page 5. And on that page 5, they have figure number 4, which shows our front elevation, which is the west elevation.
I'm with you.
Okay, and actually this is good to go back to that initial comment of the design of the house. Here you can very clearly see the stone base, the brick middle, and the wood top. And if you put that right next to their 2.5-story mansards or other structures on the street, you see that we carry those proportions into our house. That's how we're reflecting that context. And on that same note, you see the stone base, which is that bottom portion of the house. Again, the code is based on intent. And what is the intent of this requirement that you not have more than a 10-foot basement wall? And I believe what they're trying to regulate is they don't want to have a big concrete basement wall or whatever exposed to the street. And they're obviously trying to regulate the height of that basement. But when they come up with that 10 feet, they're measuring from the grade to the finished floor of our house, which is behind that wall. And typically, if this was a house sitting on a concrete foundation or something, that whole wall would be exposed. And obviously, they're trying to protect the context, the quality of the street. In our case, we're not exposing a basement wall. We have a very nice stone finish on the front of the wall. And that finish is really only 8 feet tall, 8.5 feet tall. So as far as what the basement looks like, what they're calling the basement, it's really a garage and some living level. What that looks like from the street is an 8.5 foot tall wall. So technically, we do need a variance from the 10 feet to the 9 feet, as they put it. We need a variance of 1 foot. But I think the intent here, in which should allow us to receive that variance, is that it's not an exposed wall, and the wall that is exposed from the street only appears 8.5 feet tall. And it's a nice stone wall. So we're not creating a negative context in the street. We're not presenting a negative image. In fact, it's going to be a very nice stone wall.
Okay, so to be clear, your contention is that that wall, that basement wall is actually only 8 or 8.5 feet, and therefore a variance is not necessary?
Well, I'm saying that according to their interpretation, we need a variance. We'll need a variance of 1 foot. But in order
sorry to interrupt. So
Mhm.
what is there to interpret here? I guess maybe that's where I'm a little held up. What is there to interpret? Shouldn't the plans have exact measurements on them with those dimensions?
Well, the dimensions are on there. I don't mean to be confusing. Dimensions are on there, but the 10-foot wall that they're referring to is from the grade to the first floor of the house. And you don't see the first floor on the outside of the house. So it's not really a 10-foot wall. What looks like our basement wall is really only 8.5 feet tall of natural stone, not exposed concrete.
Gotcha. So the stone portion there in the front in that figure 4, that is only 8 or 8.5 feet.
8.5 feet, correct.
Okay, gotcha. But the actual behind that wall, the first floor starts at 10 feet.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
So we do have to request this variance, but to enable you to approve it, what we're really approving is to allow us to have this 8.5-foot stone wall on the outside. It's going to be a very decorative wall, and we don't see it as a negative impact at all on the community.
Okay.
So the next item would be variance number 5, and this is referring to the width of the driveway. And I'll go back to the site plan on page 4. And first of all, some context. As staff mentions in their own review, most of these homes and these lots were developed in between 1880 and 1920, wherever they got those numbers from. Key thing is before autos existed, before most people had a car. So on the rough residence and most of the lots around here, you have an alley in the back of the lot, which is referred to as Hollander Alley. And then obviously you have the street on the front. These are narrow and very deep lots, which is typical for that time period. And most of the homes on this street either do not have any vehicular access. There's no driveways, or over the years, in order to accommodate an automobile, they put parking in either the side yards or the front yards or wherever they could fit it. Or in some lucky cases, they have garages in the front of the house. But all of them are trying to find a way to accommodate a vehicle. As part of the other zoning code that we have to reply to, the city of Cincinnati requires so many off-street parking spaces for each unit. So in order to get my building permit, I have to provide off-street parking. That's the zoning requirement. But to design a home in today's market, and even though the Ruffs are building this home for themselves, everybody has to look as though, what if I have to sell this in the future? For the cost of this lot, and in today's market, you don't build a home over 400,000 or 500,000 and not have off-street parking. The city requires it. The market requires it. You know, no one's going to spend that kind of money if they have the choice and not have some type of interior off-street parking. So we've got to find a way, both by the city's requirement, by the market's requirement, and by the Ruffs' requirement, to have off-street parking. Because the Ruffs are not interested in completing this project if they can't have off-street parking. That's one of their key ingredients, safe off-street parking. So in many cases, Hollander Alley, the reason it's there is to provide access to the rear of the properties for some type of off-street parking. Like many of the alleys around there, and especially Hollander Alley, The many times the alley's not passable. I have a 4-wheel drive truck, and coming off of Taft Avenue, there's a large hill that you go up to get onto this alley. I could not get to the Ruff's residence in that alley, even in my truck, between the trees that are hanging over, branches that are down. I mean, many times a year, the alley is just not passable. There's a large slope coming off of Taft Avenue that you have to pass over to get to this alley. So we looked at that in the very beginning, and the alley does not provide safe or reliable access to the rear of the home. If there was some emergency and they had to get out of their house, and the alley is not maintained at all, and that's the biggest problem. There's no maintenance in the alley. The pavement's falling apart. It's just not something you want to drive over. If they had to get out of their home from a rear garage and use Hollander Alley, they could very well be blocked in, and that happens now on Hollander Alley. In addition to that, and this is probably even the bigger problem, it's a one-way alley. There's no other way out of that alley. So you come off of Taft, you can't get out the other end because it's blocked. So again, if someone else's car breaks down, or things that happen in any normal given traffic or street, you might not be able to get out of your home. So we ruled out Hollander Alley from the beginning. The second option is a driveway on the side that would lead to a rear garage. This is a 60-foot wide lot. In order to put even a minimal size driveway on the side yard alongside the house, and there are required buffers, so I have to be so far off, I have to provide a buffer between the side property line and where my construction starts. By the time you take out the buffers between the driveway and the side yard, between the driveway and the house, and then on the opposite side of the house, you have a side yard setback that's required by zoning also. The width of my house keeps getting smaller and smaller, to the point where I'm looking at a house that's anywhere between 30 and 34 feet that I'm left as a footprint to build in. 34 feet is a row house. And I'm designing many homes like this downtown right now, River Road and so forth. But these are all 3-story structures, because if you can't go out, you have to go up. All of these homes have a garage in the basement, a living area, 2nd floor, bedroom area, 3rd floor. They're not wide, but they're 3 stories. So that was not a design that would get them the home that they needed, and it was not a design that would be market driven, because you're also talking about a different price value. So for what they were paying for the lot, for what they needed to develop a house here and keep it within the requirements of the market, 34 feet wide just was not going to be acceptable. So the side drive was not an option. So we're left with a front driveway and front entry garages. And there's nothing in the zoning code that says that you can't do it. Again, by other parts of the zoning code, I have to provide off-street parking. So the question is just how you do it. We're left with a front driveway. Now the driveway coming off the street, the curb cut and most of the drive is 14 feet wide as we come off of May Street, and it shows that on the front of the site plan. As you get past the sidewalk and you come to the garages, the driveway does widen out to 29 feet, but that's so that you can get a car into either one of the garages. Again, I got to provide parking spaces for 1.5 cars, which is 2 cars. So I either have to park them tandemly, which presents its own problems, or I park them side by side. And we don't have the depth to park them tandemly on the house. So they're side by side, which means I either have one big garage door or I have 2 smaller garage doors. We went for the 2 smaller ones. But either way, they got to be able to get into them. And that's where that width comes from. And there's no way you can access two parking spaces in a 14-foot wide driveway. So as we approach the house, the driveway widens as it needs to so that we can have access to the two garages out front. But again, there's nothing in the zoning that says you can't have garages on the front. And there are, I went through and just on May Street alone, in the two streets that make up our neighborhood, there are 5 other structures, which I could show you on here, houses that have garages in the front with a garage door on the street. So it is contextual. It may not be typical, but it is contextual.
Gotcha. Okay, a couple questions on the driveway. First is, I'm sort of limited here to what I can see on the Google Street View on Hollander Avenue. I have to do a site visit, which involves, driving past and walking around the area. But I don't see any one-way signs on Hollander Avenue. Where did you get the one-way from?
Well, it's one way because there's only one way in and one way out. And it's not wide enough to turn around in the alley. It's just an alley street.
How could it be one way if there's only one way in and one way out? Wouldn't that naturally have to be two-way?
Well, the street itself is not listed as a one-way, but it's not wide enough for two vehicles to pass each other. So I'm saying that it essentially makes it, let's say, a one vehicle alley, and you can get to your garage, turn in, but if you happen to be coming out and somebody else is coming in at the same time, everyone has to use the same exit and entrance on Taft Avenue. Normally you go into an alley, you have another exit entrance on the other side. That doesn't exist on this alley.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you know whether any of the other homes on May Street or what's the other street on the other side of the alley or Hemlock utilize rear parking and use Hollander Avenue as a street to get to and from that?
I did my own flyover. Like I said, when I went down there to look at the alley, I could get no further than the Ruff residence. There are, I believe, the house on the corner of May and Howard, at least the first house from that corner, they do have like a little parking area off the alley, but they're right there by the corner. And then the same thing off of Hemlock, not the house on the corner, but the next one from the corner, they appear to have some kind of parking area. Once you get past that, I don't believe there's any other parking areas in the back. So everybody's parking on the street.
Gotcha. Okay. And the driveway width at the curb cut, did you say that is 14 and then it spreads out to 29 as you get towards the garages?
Yeah, we're 14 feet as you pass through the right of way and onto the property. And it's not until we get towards the garages where it fans out to get access to the garages. And honestly, the other thing that does, it provides other areas for possible off-street parking, like any driveway. The goal is to eliminate the off-street parking, and that's a goal of the city also. Off-street parking it makes congestion. It's not safe, and that vehicles aren't safe out there. And again, it's not desired in the market. So we want to provide that off-street parking, but mainly it's just to be able to access the garage doors.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
We have to widen it.
Okay. And 29 and a half is the least amount you need to widen it in order for that to work?
It's possible we could reduce that a little bit if we found a way to, bring the garages closer together. The garages are 2 9-foot doors, and you have a access door in between them, like you have on a lot of garages. So by the time you add that all together, you're definitely well over 20 feet. And if it allowed you to approve this variance, I would definitely be willing to work and find a way to reduce that and limit it maybe to the width of the garages, however much we can reduce it. but it's definitely going to be wider than 14 feet. 14 feet wouldn't even be wide enough to go to one large garage door, which is typically 16 feet. So that would be an option.
How wide are the two garage doors, including the, I'm still looking at figure 4 here, but I can see the access door in the middle. How wide is that from one end to the other, from north to south on the garage doors? Do you know?
I do. I have my CAD drawings in front of me. They're 9-foot garage doors, I know that. And as it's laid out, we have 29 feet. It's 29 feet from jamb to jamb of the garage doors. And, there's not a lot of space in between there. We have a 3-foot man door, and then you have about 1.5 feet on each side of there, which I need structurally just to support that wall up above, and add those together, and you have 29 feet. The garage doors themselves, the garage doors themselves are wider. So there's the potential to reduce that width by maybe reducing the width of the garage doors, if that would help approve the variance.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a bunch of standards I have to look at here. One of them is, a hardship or, some unique condition about the property that makes it impractical or, economically impractical to build it to code. And so, I mean, those are typically the sort of questions to ask. What is preventing you from building this to code? Is it just preference? Which is fine. I understand that, but the standards sort of
sure
prevent me from just doing it based on preference. There needs to be some sort of actual hardship or something unique about the property that prevents it from being able to be built to code, and just wanting a wider driveway or two, larger garage doors. It's not enough with the code.
Yeah, absolutely. But the code requires us to provide at least 2 off-street parking spaces, 2 off-street, place for 2 cars. I can't access from the rear. I don't have the room for a side driveway. And there's nothing that says you can't have garages on the front. I mean, as far as my understanding, now they'll say that it's not part of the context, but there are 6 or I think it was 5 or 6 other homes that have garages in the front of them just within this neighborhood. So it does exist within the neighborhood. So then the question is, what's the best way to do it? Because we're left with the front. I have to provide this parking. And I don't have the depth to do it tandem. So we're left with garage doors. And I've got to access those garage doors. So it's kind of a domino effect. Now, can we reduce that 29 feet? That's possible. I could see reducing that by as much as 4 feet if we found some other garage doors to use. But I have to have them there, and I have to be able to access them.
Okay. Thanks. I may have some more questions later, but that's all I have on the driveway, right?
So that's variance number 5 then. And again, it's going from the 14 feet to the 29. We might be able to reduce that, but we have to have access to those garages in the front.
Okay.
Variance number 3 refers to the height of the eave. And the eave is that part, it's not the height of the roof, the top of the roof. The eave is basically where your gutter is. It's that line where the slope of the roof meets the vertical face of the wall. The current form-based code, the T4, restricts that to 24. Our design, after we reduced it is 26. And it's worth saying that, we didn't design this and just say it's this or nothing. We went through several options of how we could change this design, lowered the roof, raised the grade. We went through months of reworking this to hopefully get the things in there that we needed, but also meet this form-based code. And 26 was as flat as we could make the front of the house. The code also requires an overall height of no more than 35 feet, and we're well within that 35 feet. It's just where this eave ends up. But again, I go back to two things. It's a form-based code that's trying to mimic the context of the neighborhood. And if you go through the neighborhood, in fact, if you even look at the examples given by staff, in fact, their own comments, they make the statement that if any of these homes were built today, they'd be over the 24 feet, and they'd probably need, well, they didn't say they'd need a variance, but if you built them today, they'd be over 24 feet. 24 feet is a very low number. So a lot of the homes on this street where we're talking about context, and that's on the rough side of the street, are already above this 24 feet. And then we have that magic dividing line where across the street, somebody can come in and go to 4 stories if they want. And that's going to be, in fact, there's already developments proposed for across the street. But tomorrow, if somebody wanted to, without any variances, they could build something a whole story higher than the roughs and with higher eaves. So the house that we designed has more to do with the houses on each side of them than even the form-based code is referencing. Because on this street, 70% of the homes, if you go down the street and just count them off, 70% of the homes are already above this height. And I had one diagram in my application that took an aerial view and showed that. Most of those homes are already over 2.5 stories, and we'll talk about that in a minute also. So what we're asking for here is an 8% change in the code from 24 feet to 26 feet, 8%. And that's to put us in a scale with the rest of the neighborhood. And we have to do that because structurally, I've got, by the time you take 3 levels in today and build them today, it's almost impossible to be within that. You can't do it within 24 feet. We found a way to do it within 26 feet. That's as low as we can structurally get it. So I think we should approve this variance because we do meet the intent of the code, which is reflecting the form and the context of the neighborhood. And we're asking for an 8% variance in order to do that. I'm not hearing you.
I'm sorry. That applies mostly to variance number 3, is that right?
That is variance number 3, correct.
Okay.
So variance 1 and 2, although they talk about different portions of the house, are basically come down to the same issue. Variances 1 and 2, for different reasons, require, call this structure 3 stories, which it is a 3-story structure, where the T4 zone only allows 2.5. And rather than getting into the individual variances, what it comes down to is allowing the difference between a 2.5-story structure and a 3-story structure to grant those 2 variances. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to go back to the intent of the zoning, which is to mimic the form, context, and size of the neighborhood. And the fact that we're in a gray area here. We're literally on the rough side of the street. As I've said before, zoning's requiring 2.5. Opposite side of the street, 4 stories. they could be forced to only build a 2.5-story structure, but every time they come out their door, someone across the street is building a 4-story home or a 3-story home. And that is a hardship on the roughs. It's both an economic and a personal hardship, in that a piece of property that they've already purchased, a piece of property that they want to build a home on, and that eventually has to be a market-driven home, has to compete with something right across the street that is in a completely different zone and can build a completely different home. And if they have to sell their home in 5 years or whatever, and across the street they can build a nice 3-story that has all the current amenities of today, not based on a 1920 model. They've got a garage, they've got a driveway, they've got what people are looking for in a home today. And across the street on the rough side, they're required to conform to the literal reading of the zoning. That is a hardship. And beyond that, again, it's the context of the neighborhood. And there's no magic line down the middle of the street. There's no brick wall down the street that divides these 2.5-story structures from the 3- and 4-story structures. If you take that whole context into consideration, allowing them to build a 3-story on this particular street in this neighborhood is more in context than the 2.5-story that the zoning is strictly dictating. And the second point, as I've made before, is even on their side of the street, 70% of those existing structures, and you can jump on Google and run down the street. Sure, there are a couple, there are some 2.5 stories. They showed pictures of them. But 70% of them are closer to 3 stories or higher. By their own regulations, they would be considered 3-story or even one or 2 or 4-story. So if you take all that context into consideration, asking for a variance from 2.5 stories to 3 stories, which is a 16% variance on the height, and considering that even if you grant that to 3 stories, we're still below the overall height requirement of 35 feet. We're still going to be below what somebody could build across the street. But the 3 stories allows them to get those garages in the front where they have no other place to put them. It allows them to build a home that's not only what they want, but what's expected in the market's place, especially for this price range. And it's more in context with the neighborhood. It is in context with the neighborhood than restricting them to 2.5 stories. And that's for both variants in 1 and 2, because as I said, you can read them individually, but they both come down to granting this as a 3-story versus a 2.5-story structure.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to tell me about this project or this request?
Well, those are our review of the variances. In summary, I think, again, if you look at the intent of the code, form and context, if you look at this street, not the entire area of Walnut Hills where this code was overlaid, but if you look at this street, even though it may be a modern structure, the size of this in 3 stories is more in context with the street than a 2.5-story structure. It is in, and they all exist together. That's what's cool about a city. You've got 4 stories, 3 stories, 2 stories. That's what makes up the street. And this street in particular, as I've said before, it's a mixture of 2 zones. And what your granting of these variances allows us to do is fix that gray area. It's not like we're in the middle of the zone somewhere. We're on the edge, and there's another edge right here that we're up against. They're already getting ready to build some things over there. So these variances allow us to fix that gray area. And the strict interpretation of the code, they don't see them as hardships. But if they can't provide off-street parking, one, it's a requirement of zoning, but it's also a hardship to them, because now if they want to stay in this lot, and the owner of the lot grew up in this area, he grew up in Walnut Hills, that's why they want to be here. They're bringing a very nice home, very high level, cost level of home. They're bringing permanent ownership, all those other questions that I didn't go into them individually, but this home is going to serve as a catalyst for this area, catalyst for other homeowners to hopefully come in and approve. And this is something that's going to have to be dealt with. Even if somebody comes in and remodels the home next to them, spends a couple $100,000 to remodel a home, they're going to be looking for off-street parking. They're going to have to provide off-street parking. And we think this is one way to deal with it. And specific to the Rough residents, it's the only way they can deal with it, because they don't have an alley that's reliable or safe, or in some cases even passable, to use as regular transportation to their house. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions you have, and I'll wait to respond after the zoning staff gives their review.
Okay, great. Ms. Ruff, did you want to add anything initially to Mr. Koninger's comments?
No, we spoke prior to this, so everything that he said is good so far.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, I will have some questions, but I'll give Trey an opportunity to testify here and you to respond, and if my questions aren't addressed, I'll revisit them. So Trey, anything you'd like to add?
Just that when the planning department establishing form-based code districts, establishing the code and the district itself was a very lengthy process over many years. And as they chose these different zoning transects or districts in the base code, but as they chose these transects, they did this to apply form-based code to what was the prevailing with the character of what was existing there already. So for example, the fact that there are different districts across May Street, and as you go southward toward McMillan, that's in part because there were already larger apartment buildings and other churches, other large buildings. So I hope that explains that context. It is not arbitrary, or as Mr. Koenig said, a magic line in the middle of the street. They chose that based upon what the prevailing architectural form was. And it was a very careful process. And it's limited to only 4 neighborhoods in Cincinnati. And it does not expand all the way into the surrounding. Usually it's along a main corridor in each of the instances. In this case, pretty much along with Millen. And so that's the same as it would be in our other zoning districts. So something across the street or down the street can have a different building requirements for it based upon what that the character of that is. If it's more multifamily instead of single family, and so on. So I wanted to emphasize that was purposeful. They chose the districts and matched them up to the forms based upon what they thought the prevailing use was at the time, and the prevailing forms. As to some of the specifics, and perhaps Emily can weigh in, because she actually dealt with Mr. Koenig a lot based on trying to interpret the code to the specifics of it. But part of my staff report speaks to not just what the prevailing architecture is, but also questioning how it would create a hardship to I mean, some of these it seems could have been fairly simple modifications. I did have several conversations with Ms. Ruff, try to explain to her the context of how we even looked at some images online of what either and in a modern context, what a modern home might look like with dormers. The code encourages dormer. Basically, the definition of a half story requires that it be predominantly underneath the roof and underneath the roof, and that the additional habitable space up there be accomplished with the use of dormers. So you can either do that with a somewhat traditional roof and have a dormer that comes out and is peaked like that for windows and so on, or rounded or even squared on the top that project out or inward from the roof. And then the other type, the reason I mentioned mansard, there are several examples in the neighborhood, but that's another roof type. And I've worked with other designers and builders in the form-based code context to create a modern mansard. The reason I spoke to that, and I believe that both Emily and I had spoken with both Mr. Koeniger and Ms. Ruff about that, is because if you did a modern mansard, you increase the habitable space, David. You don't limit the space, because if you had a traditional, more pitched roof, then you'd end up with the upper habitable story, that half story might have canted ceilings or just be limited and pushed back. Whereas if you do a mansard roof that has a very steep angle to the front of it, it allows you additional habitable space in that.
So Trey, are you saying that, and I'm looking at figure 4 here in your staff report, are you saying that that top portion from the west elevation, you're saying that top red portion there, if that was a mansard style roof and the roof came down over that portion, that it would be conforming?
Yes, if you would be able to achieve the eave height there if you had that canted, and then the windows, for example, the larger windows with the 4 panes on them, the top of them could then have kind of a little shed roof, if you will. I mean, I'm taking the modern context. That really eaves done this way could be either modern or traditional or mimic historic. But if you had that roof come down, and then the as the code mentioned, it just says this is achieved through the use of dormers. So those windows could have a separate little roof to them, which would act as a dormer, and then the eave height would have been able to come down to 24. So there was a great deal of discussion. I'll let Emily speak to that as well, but I know that I spoke to both Mr. Koeniger and to Ms. Ruff about how that might be achieved, and with Ms. Ruff specifically, we was on the internet and saw some examples of how that might be able to be achieved. And it's not to say we're trying to replicate a historic district. I was showing modern examples of it with metal roofing or other elements that could be incorporated into a modern design and still meet the intent of the code and that. So
is it your opinion then that the actual height of the building is out of context for the neighborhood?
Not the height of the roof, but the height of the eave. It's not supposed to have a full 3rd story. That's how the code defined it, and there are pictorial examples of it in the code. There gives several examples. The first page of you'll see those in my staff report. The first page of that T4 zoning district of the T4 and SF shows at least one, if not 2 examples in there. And then they show a diagram, which is also in my staff report. There's a diagram that shows how that can be achieved. Now that's showing a traditional roof, more traditional peaked or gabled roof. Whereas, as I stated, if you see that in there, it shows the building form, it's figure 7. But below it, you can see where there's a mansard roof immediately below figure 7, and figure 8 shows how basically, when I've looked through this with other design professionals, the reason I'm not saying you have to do a mansard roof, I just, in working with other design professionals, it's allowed them to have more livable space because they don't have that steeply pitched roof, right? It allows you to build out as close to the facade line as possible, and yet still be within the, still meet the standards of the code.
Okay, got it.
Does that? I hope I explained that carefully enough, because it's fairly important contextually, because it especially would work in a very modern design and still be able to meet the code requirement.
Yeah, I understand. I understand your point there. Is there anything else you wanted to?
I thought if Emily wanted to weigh in to some of the specifics, because they primarily communicated following my initial meeting and communication with Mr. Koeniger, I did follow up with Ms. Ruff and tried to give those examples of how the home might be designed. And then primarily Emily and Mark went into the specifics of the relief as to the height and the garage and so on. So.
All right, great. Thank you, Trey. Emily, is there anything you'd like to add?
Trey's report largely sums up our position on this project. Ultimately, it's a new house on a vacant lot. We did not identify any special circumstances on this lot that prohibit it from conforming with the code to construct a new single-family residence. This lot's actually wider than the majority of the surrounding residential lots, so you have more space to work with. Particularly in terms of the driveway issue. So in this case, our finding is that they've designed a house that doesn't conform with the code and doesn't meet the variance standards for the relief they've requested. I know there's been a lot of discussion of the context to the west and that more permissive zoning district. That actually went through a zone change process in the past few years, which was the public process and public hearing process to the Planning Commission to change it to the more permissive zoning to facilitate the redevelopment of those lots. So that was a public process that input was taken to allow the additional height and different development standards there from what's permitted on the east side. So I guess, I'll focus on sort of the two main elements of relief, the height, and that's really the 2.5 stories and the eave height are the main height issues that we identified. And ultimately the code is just looking for a different form. It's not the overall, the dimensional measure of height, it's that we're in form-based code and they want the eaves to be a certain height and they want the number of stories to match that 2.5 stories. So there is a possibility to design a modern house without exceeding the number of permitted stories in the eave height regulations. And then on the driveway issue, the intent of the code is to promote a walkable neighborhood. So the wider front driveway and parking as the primary streetscape feature is not consistent with the desired streetscape that form-based code is trying to promote. There's many ways you could provide off-street parking for a house on this site without exceeding the maximum curb cut or driveway width. There's no requirement to provide access from the alley, and there's no prohibition on front access parking if you can do it within the parameters of the code. So this is, again, just to keep the parking from being the predominant streetscape feature on the front of the house. And in my measurements, correct me if I'm wrong, Trey, but there actually appears to be adequate lot size to meet the minimum setback requirements, provide the same footprint, and provide a driveway that would lead to some sort of rear access garage or detached garage without shrinking the width and the footprint of the house because you have 3-foot minimum side setbacks. And currently there's 16 feet total on either side of the house.
That's correct. The other factor is that there is no buffer requirement for a driveway itself. It's only for parking areas. Like I noted that Mr. Koeniger pointed that out. And there's when you have parking areas like a parking lot, you need to provide a kind of buffer and screening and so on. But that's not the case for just a driveway. So you could have. I agree with Emily in the context of this. You could have a side access driveway along the side of the house. It would be entirely possible.
Okay. All right. Anything else, Emily?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you for your testimony. All right, Mr. Koeniger, got roughly 5 minutes or maybe a little bit more for response and any closing arguments. I do have another few zoning hearings scheduled this morning. So if you'd like to respond and make any closing remarks before we adjourn.
Keep it short.
Thanks.
In general, a number of times they'll say, basically, we don't see why you can't do this. And the driveway is a perfect example. Have you walked or even driven the alley back there? And I guess you can answer that, but the alley and this was brought up several times in the beginning when we were working with them, do a rear entry garage. Well, you can't use the alley. The alley is not dependable access. It's not even safe access because of the one way in, one way out. So that was not an option. And you know, they talk about wanting to make it a walkable neighborhood and the width of the driveway being a problem. But again, our driveway is 14 feet from the curb. It's 14 feet as you pass the sidewalk. It's 14 feet as you get past the right of way. It's not until we get to the driveways or the garages that it actually widens. We'd be happy to put landscape across the front. You know, we talked about this. We could do shrubs across the front or something to where you don't even know that that wider area exists. All you'll see, just like on the walls of the house that existed before us, all you would see would be the driveway crossing the sidewalk. Sure, if you look over the shrubs, you'll see it. But if you're concerned about the context and the walkability of the neighborhood, you know, landscape would take care of the visibility problem of the driveway and would enhance the neighborhood and the sidewalk. So, you know, that's an easy fix that we would be more than happy to provide and show on a landscape plan.
Mr. Koeniger, what about the suggestion that there could be a driveway that goes along the side of the house leading to rear garages?
Well, again, you know, it's just like the mansard. You know, they say that the mansard could work and they say that the side drive could work, but it can work, but only if you build a house that's 30 feet wide. And correct, there isn't a buffer requirement between the driveway and the side property line, but there are landscape requirements. So I can't put my driveway right on the property line for physical reasons. And then I have to have space between the driveway and the house. I can't put a narrow driveway right on the side of the house because that prevents its own problems. So I need some kind of buffer between those. And there are other building code issues as far as the width and the setbacks on the side of the house. You know, if I build closer than 5 feet to the side of a property line, then I've got fire issues on the walls where I have to fire rate them and other issues like that. So trying to provide as much space between the houses, we went with that 8 feet in between there. Sure, it could be smaller, but you're still not going to be able to get a side driveway in there unless you do a house that's 30 to 34 feet wide. And then now you're really looking at something that needs to be taller because you've just cut 14 feet out of the width of the house. You've got to make that space up somewhere. And typically what happens is you go up. So I don't see where the side driveway is physically possible. And we looked at and still maintain the type of house without having to add even more space on a third floor. And, you know, Trey is right as far as the mansards, but he's right as far as all you're looking at is a 2.5-story house in space in an attic or in a half story. You know, I mean, he's correct. Doing a mansard, which is basically go over here, vertical walls and tilting them in like this. That's what he's talking about. If you took our design and took those top walls and tilt them in like this, then you could potentially, you know, call that a mansard, but it's still on a third floor. And what he's comparing, and you still have structure in there, you're still losing a lot of living space compared to actual walls. He's comparing it to a pitched roof, you know, or what we would refer to as an attic space. And yeah, that mansard provides a lot more space, but it doesn't provide the space that we have on that third floor. So we would be losing a substantial amount of living area if we went to the third floor. And you're still going to have a house that's as tall as we have it now, which is under the requirement. And you're still going to have 3 floors. So why go through all the gymnastics of forcing this to look like a mansard when you're still going to have the same basic size house? You're still going to have the same basic form and context. It's just, it's making it look more like a mansard than it does now. So I don't see what any of that does besides force the Ruffs into less living area in a house that they don't want to build. So the question again is 3 stories appropriate for this neighborhood. A neighborhood where 70% of the houses are already 3 stories or more. And again, Trey, you know, I'm not saying that there's some kind of magic line in the middle of the street. I understand how zoning is created, but we still have 2 edges of 2 different zoning districts that are coming together. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with 4 stories across the street, 2.5 on one side? The variance is what eliminates those gray areas. That's what variances are used for. Something that doesn't specifically fit within this zoning for this specific instance. And in our case, I think this is a perfect example of that. You've got an existing street where the majority of the structures are already taller than they're requiring. By their own admittance, the eaves are already taller than what they're requiring. And across the street, anybody can build a 4-story structure if they wish. These variances will allow us to not only accommodate the Ruffs, but accommodate the neighborhood and put a house in there that's going to be able to compete contextually, aesthetically, and even market-wise with whatever could be built across the street. They're going to spend a lot of money here. They just want to make sure they do it in the right way. That's not going to bite them down the road. So I know we're short on time, but again, you know, there are many limitations that they just aren't willing to recognize, from the alley to the construction of a roof on a house. And taking all those into consideration and the context of the neighborhood, it just seems perfectly reasonable and understandable why a 3-story house has more to do with all the other 3-story houses that already exist on this street than a 2.5-story. And it's a variance of 16%. It's not like we're asking for 4 stories, which could be across the street. It's not like we're asking for 10 feet above the eave. We're asking for 8%, to build a house that's in scale with the rest of the houses on the neighborhood.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Kanninger?
I think that sums it up.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll leave it at that then. I want to thank everyone here for their time and their testimony today. I will take this under consideration. I need to do a site visit. I want to re-review all of the application materials and the testimony here today. That usually takes about 2 weeks. As soon as I make a decision, I need to formalize that decision in a written opinion. And so as soon as I finish that, I will put it into a PDF, and I'll email it to everybody who's in the hearing today. So you all will have it just moments after it's complete. And yeah, I think that's it. If you guys have any questions in the meantime, or you'd like a status update on the decision, feel free to reach out to me or to Cassandra Manus, and we can give you an update on the status. Any other questions right now?
No.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you all again. Hope you have a